Welcome back. We're now going to do part 2 where we span from a multisig address. And remember, a multisig address or multi-signature address is an address in a wallet where you need typically several individuals to sign any spending transaction from that particular address. So we come back, and it may be a year since we last spent from them, so we really want to start by validating the address. Now let's assume that we've done that. Normally, we would then find an unspent transaction output using something like a list unspent. Now here's the thing. If we do that, then the list unspent command does indeed have the option of listing what is unspent from an address. But in the case of these multi-signature addresses, they don't actually appear in the list unspent output. So we can try this on our Linux machine or on the Macintosh where this was actually sent. And in neither case does the list unspent command show this transaction. So let's instead just look up the particular transaction ID. And of course, we could also have done this in a block explorer. So we can go to a block explorer, look up either the address or the transaction ID, and either one would be fine if they have been confirmed. But this one has not been confirmed yet. So we need to resort to other means. We'll simply take the transaction ID and we will use a get raw transaction command to get the raw transaction itself in hexadecimal format, copy that, put that into decode raw transaction to see the actual contents of the transaction. So here's the transaction ID, where does it take its input from, and what's the value of the various outputs. Now here is the crucial part. The outputs from the transaction are, first of all, the output sent to our address, the multisig address of 150, and then some leftovers, which is sent to another address, which the wallet decides on its own how to do this. And so we want this output number 1 here. So this is important. So we want this transaction ID, and then we want output number 1. Okay? So remember these two, this and a 1. So now let's go and look at some help here. We're going to create a new transaction, a raw transaction. So let's do help create raw transaction. And let's just look at the first few lines. So here is what we can do is we can create a raw transaction by specifying which transactions we're going to use as inputs. So which unspent transaction outputs we're going to use as inputs. As before, we use single exclamation marks to limit interpretation of what's inside. So here we want the transaction ID itself. So here's a label, txid : and then we want the transaction ID itself, which is this thing. So put that in here. And then we want to specify, comma, the out, : and that was our 1. So this is so now we have the input to the transaction. Now we want to send this somewhere, and it doesn't really matter where we send it. Let's just get a new address from the Macintosh wallet here. Get new address. So this is where we're going to send it. Address, so again we want like this. I'm not quite sure this is correct, but that's largely beside the point. So we want to do address : so let's do 149. or just 140, and we leave the rest for the minor. Now, it says, the error message says value is type array, expected on object, and the reason is that this square brackets are not supposed to be there. So this is the correct format, and it doesn't complain, it simply gives us the transaction. So we can now decode this transaction, but we don't really want to do that. Instead, what we really want to do is we now want to sign this transaction. So let's sign this transaction, sign row transaction, and normally this would be enough. But in this case, the signature is not complete. So let's take the output. Now this is the output. This output is this transaction plus the signature from the Linux wallet. We need to sign it with the other wallet also. So let's sign raw transaction. And now it's complete. Both wallets have signed it, and only then do we get complete equals true. And now we take this output again and we send this raw transaction. Send this out. And we have a transaction ID. We've spent the output. If you get complete equal to false here, then it hasn't been signed properly by one party or the other. And it's a major bummer when this happens because you don't know where the error was. So you need to go through everything carefully again, and the mistake could be anywhere. It could be that you haven't done the create multisig correctly, add multisig address correctly. You didn't try validate address. So remember, you needed to do validate address and then the actual strange looking address with the 3 in it, and so forth. So there are also, so you needed to validate this particular address. So make sure that you go through this, and this is really the only debugging you can do. You can do validation of the multisig address in both the wallets that are trying to sign it. You need to get is mine to be true, and once you have that, you have a reasonable chance of being able to sign it, as long as this is the conclusion in both the wallets. So that concludes our quick little overview of multisig addresses. They really are abominable to actually work with because they're sufficiently complicated that you need to look it up every single time. But such is life.